Okay, to avoid your malaise, which I'm sure you're experiencing after lunch, I want to ask you all a question so that you'll be on the defensive when you ask me questions. I want to ask all of you, what has your last experience of nature been? Your last experience of nature. And I'll try to call on people as I see hands raised. Yes?
Stepped outside to eat my pizza.
Stepped outside to eat your pizza. That's close to where I'm going. Anybody else? Yes?
I
Photograph the sunrise and the sunsets almost every day. Yes? Skied the Lake Fork Trail. And it was close, but it's interesting. Let's see. How many of you ate lunch just a second ago? Why is that not your last experience of nature? And that's one of the things that Anna Lappé, who does that every time she speaks in front of a university crowd, what she quizzes them and then points out. Anna Lappé is the daughter of Francis Moore Lappé, who wrote Diet for a Small Planet. Anna wrote the book Diet for a Hot Planet, which says that food is the greatest protagonist for climate change. Food is the greatest protagonist for climate change. Okay, I'm a preacher, teacher, pastor, so you're going to hear me speak out of two resources. The first one is spiritual practice. And spiritual practice has that understanding that Julian of Norwich put out there, one of the great Western mystics, that spiritual practice is about what you do regularly, consistently, and persistently. So we all do it, right? It's what you have in your bloodstream. It's what becomes your heart. We're all involved with some kind of spiritual practice because we're all spiritual beings. And in that process of spiritual practice, we come to recognize that food, because it's something that we do regularly, persistently, and consistently, we eat, that's a spiritual practice that we do. So how do we begin to recognize it as that? How do we begin to act on it? So the second source that I turn to as a pastor, preacher, and teacher is Scripture, of course. And there are some big, big stories that ancient mythologies that need to be laid out. One of them is the first creation story in Genesis, and we are told by biblical scholars that you should pay attention every single time you come to an interruption in poetry, because that is a point of emphasis for whoever is writing that scriptural story. And that is found in the first story of creation when you go through that priestly writer writes and says, and seeds upon seeds upon seeds, and seeds sprouting seeds, and seeds of every kind and variety. The interruption as a way of emphasizing that God is a regenerational God, that God gives abundantly into the world, that God loves diversity. And that's interesting, because farmers in Montana, many of them who farm locally and organically, refer to themselves as regenerational farmers. To think about that. In the book, The Soil Will Save Us, Kristen Olson says, there are more microorganisms in a teaspoon of healthy soil than there are human beings that have ever lived on the planet. Seeds upon seeds upon seeds. This is the world that we have been given, and this is the way that we move through that world, is to understand that God's will is to give abundantly. So you're hearing some of that preaching that comes through. But one of those other big stories is the wilderness story. The children of Israel are freed from Egypt, and they do not walk right out into the promised land. They must traverse a land that has traditionally been known as barren. But what we find in that is that it's not so much being barren, it is bringing to the wilderness an intentionality and mindfulness about food. And this is where I think kosher really begins. That the Jewish practice of kosher, having a spiritual practice about food, begins in the wilderness. Because if you're going to have intentionality and mindfulness, you're going to be able to discover that insect larva we now call manna, or bread from heaven, that is food that you can eat. you're going to discover your protein and when quail migrating season is as it comes across. And you are also going to discover in that new place, in that new land, that there is water that can be taken from rock if you hit it in just the right way. The Israelites walk out into the wilderness or the desert, and they say, Moses, we want to go back to Egypt because there we had macaroni and cheese. They become whiners and complainers in the desert or the wilderness like we all do, a new place, because they don't have the food supply that they once had. It's a place of food insecurity. And food insecurity is based on 3 pillars. Number 1, food insecurity is based on the idea that there should be, and there is not, a food supply of nutritious food over a long period of time. Food insecurity is built on the notion that there is not a ready access to that food supply. I know in the west side of Rockford, which the USDA has called a food desert, they didn't have public transportation to get into the supermarkets. And the third thing that food insecurity is built on, that pillar, is that you have to have the knowledge to deliver that nutritious food. Do you know how to cook? We talked about that earlier today. So you're asking me, Mike, was there ever a time in a community or a nation's history when there might have been a sense of intentionality and mindfulness that we had to apply when we thought we were living in a food desert, when we had to bring that? Why, yes, there was. Eating in the wilderness. What does that look like? And it was around World War I and World War II. And these are some posters that come from the Smithsonian. Maybe you've seen some of them before. This is from Canada. Can all you can. Food thrift, your patriotic gift. This looks like a foodie poster, right, from today? Food. Buy it with thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local foods, serve just enough, use what is left. Don't waste it. Grow your own, be sure. Remember victory gardens as such an important part of living in that food wilderness or desert. Grow your own vegetables. Plant a victory garden because our food is fighting. Come out into the garden with Dad. Here's a Canadian War poster. And how it becomes not just an individual activity, but a communal activity, a familial activity. Gotta love the patriotic garb here. Don't you always want to have one of those at the ready? Are you a victory canner? We'll have lots to eat this winter, won't we, Mother? Mother knows best, and she is canning as a way of doing patriotic duty. Waste not, want not. Prepare for winter. This is one from Great Britain. Better to potluck with Churchill today than humble pie with Hitler tomorrow. Don't waste food. Save the producers of the land. Eat more fish. And of course, not only victory gardens at home, but school gardens. We're seemingly getting back into some of those practices. And this is one that is kind of the punishing food practice. The greatest crime in Christendom is the wasting of food. Waste the food and help the Hun. And this one is a young boy who pledges to fast from sugar during the war so that the war process goes better for the country. Food is a weapon. Don't waste it. So these are the practices we did as a nation when we believed that we were in the midst of a food desert or a wilderness. We brought intentionality and mindfulness. And kosher among the Jewish people, like any deep spiritual practice, has continued to evolve over time. But it began with this understanding that kosher is about how you prepare your food, how you eat your food. Also, it's about where you think the food came from, what's the source of power for that food, and also who you eat with out of that time. So kosher practice begins with those particular notions, and we have another big biblical story that's a part of it. The Babylonian exile was one of the worst times of all times for the Jewish people. And the prophet Daniel is taken as one of the very skilled seers and interpreters of dreams and visions, and he's brought into the Babylonian court. And one of the servants that Daniel befriends says to him, you need to eat the meat and the wine of the king, or, if he comes back and sees you gaunt, I'm going to be in trouble. My head's going to roll. And Daniel says, wait a minute, give me a little time. Let me eat my vegetables and my water and stay kosher, and then you come back and see how I am. And you know how this ends, is he comes back to see Daniel, and Daniel, of course, is glowing. He looks peachy. That is how kosher practice continues, is the idea that you don't eat the meat and the wine of the empire in the face of that identity. It's a way of asserting who you are and whose you are in the world. And that continues. You have all these kinds of feeding stories that go on in the New Testament. This understanding of kosher gets extended. And we begin to see kosher practice becoming and evolving even more with Jesus and Paul, who identify themselves as Jew, but unfortunately become known as Christians as time goes forward. That is kosher practice and how you should be in the world. It's about food rules, really. It is the rule about how you will eat with one another, your social fabric. It is the rule about how you shall know where your food source is. It is the food rule that is about your health. And I say that kosher practice is evolving because we know somebody like Michael Pollan, who wrote In Defense of Food and then had the movie just show up on PBS this past month, has developed his own food rules. In fact, the umbrella rule he has is 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And so he turned it back to his readers and he said, so what are your food rules? What do you have? And he received hundreds of thousands of responses of people who had their own food rules. If you're not hungry enough to eat an apple, then you are not hungry. I love this. The Chinese have a saying, eat until you are 7/10 full and save the other 3/10 for hunger. That way, food always tastes good and you don't eat too much. This is my favorite, and it seems self-evident to me. Don't eat egg salad from the vending machine. From my Romanian grandmother, breakfast you should eat alone, lunch with a friend, and dinner give to your enemy. Don't eat anything you aren't willing to kill yourself. When you're eating, don't talk about other past meals, whether they be better or worse. Focus on what's in front of you. Good meals are more thoroughly enjoyed this way, and lousy meals can yield their own useful information. I'll never cook that way again. It's also more polite to food and cook alike. Eat foods in inverse proportion to how much its lobby spends to push it. So as you go out and you see big billboards for Burger King or for McDonald's, you'll know. This is about somebody who has been working with eating disorders. I came up with this rule. Don't create arbitrary rules for eating if their only purpose is to help you feel in control. I try to eat healthfully, but if there's a choice between eating ice cream and spending all day obsessing about eating ice cream, I'm going to eat the ice cream. Make and take your own lunch to work. My father has always done this, and so have I. It saves money, and you know what you are eating. Avoid snack foods with O sounds in their names. Doritos, Fritos, Tostitos, Hostess Ho-Hos. And this is the one I'll end with on terms of food rules. You don't get fat on food you pray over. This is from a friend who points out that meals prepared at home, served at the table, and given thanks for are more appreciated and more helpful than food eaten on the run. We are in the midst of a food crisis in many ways. We are people who are struggling with an overabundance of type 2 diabetes. I'm one of them. Heart disease. My dad died of heart disease. And all kinds of maladies that can be attributed to the food practice that we are all about. And this is something where we can spawn hope out of just our daily personal food practice and how it ripples out to all people in the world. Billings needs a food hub for people who are producing locally and organically. You can be a participant in making all of that happen. You can start a meatless Monday yourself, just as a way to wean yourself from things that aren't necessarily good for you to be at the center of your diet. You can start shopping more and more at the farmer's market. Bill McKibben says, talking to two sociologists, that people have 10 times more conversations at a farmer's market than they do in a supermarket, building the social fabric with food. And you, of all people, can begin to eat in such a way that gives hope to the world. Anna Lappé says, hope isn't calculating whether the good news wins out over the bad. It is simply a choice to take action. Thank you.